My name is Paul Fellinger, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Secretariat of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. When I look around here in this heptagon seating, which is very special, which reflects the heptagon logo of the Policy Network, I'm amazed to see everybody here, and I'm amazed to see what this Policy Network has become. 7 years ago, many stakeholders still had to be convinced that there is a structural problem with jurisdictions on the internet. Today, this sounds quite unbelievable. The Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network was created in 2012 after a series of international consultations with key actors. And those consultations confirmed that there was a need for stakeholders to have an ongoing space for discussions and policy development. Since 2012, this policy network has grown. It engages today over 200 entities around the world who share a commitment to jointly develop solutions. This is the second time after the first global conference of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network in Paris that such a diverse and critical mass of actors is gathered and united in one room. We have 3 days to progress. This is a precious opportunity. Let's make it count. When we leave Ottawa, we need to have a clear roadmap with a clear work plans for how to progress together in this policy network. We don't have to reiterate how wrong things can go. We all know that. These problems will not magically go away. Neither will the solutions magically appear. Those are unprecedented challenges, and the stakes are high. The responsibility to find solutions is bestowed upon our generation. We will be measured by history on how we collectively address them. We all know that the decisions and the actions that are taken now or not taken will have a long-lasting impact on future generations to come. Let us not pretend that it is easy, because easy it is not. Even Vint Cerf wrote last Wednesday in the Financial Times that our work here in Ottawa is more difficult than inventing the internet itself. Nobody, not even in this room, has the silver bullet. What we know is that solutions have to be as transnational as the internet itself to scale and adapt to this fast-changing ecology. You in this room, you are gathered here today to advance and to figure out what path we want to go down together and collectively. Can we continue doing nothing, waiting for things to solve themselves on their own? Clearly not. The cost of inaction has already been dire. It empowers those who subvert this amazing creation of mankind to do harm and to exploit social fractions. But can we continue to just frantically take patching actions under the pressure of urgency without properly considering the consequences? Clearly not either. Short-term fixes for these fundamental issues produce a legal arms race, and this is detrimental to all, even for those who initially triggered those in the first place.
And this is a difficult situation. This is a difficult time. When actually the very tools and the very legal tools that are available become the obstacle, when they're actually preventing mankind from finding the solutions to the transnational problems that we're all facing, then it actually is the joint responsibility of all concerned actors to assemble, to gather their thoughts, and to develop improved mechanisms for policymaking and new governance frameworks. I think nobody is better placed than the people in this room to understand and to feel the frustrations and the limitations that are attached to the status quo. As I said in the very introduction, you are striving but also struggling many times to find the solutions to the problems you're confronted with. And of course, a compounding factor is that there is mistrust between the actors. There's mistrust between governments. There are mistrust between the governments and the other actors. There are mistrust between the different actors, competition. And no solution will be found without basically overcoming this mistrust. And this is precisely what this is intending to do, building the relationship, allowing all of the actors to overcome this fundamental mistrust and work towards a common purpose. The good thing, I must say, is that the intersessional work that has been done between Paris and Ottawa in the different contact groups that have been set up is actually very encouraging, because it shows a remarkable degree of commitment by the people who participated. More than 60 people have worked through many months in virtual meetings with the help of the Secretariat and across time zones to actually produce the basis that is going to be used for this conference. And they're not perfect, and the policy options documents are not the final say on all those issues. But they are, at this stage, I think, a proper image and the best effort that the stakeholders have made to describe where the debate is and to help frame the discussions further. And actually the way they discussed was very encouraging, and we hope that the spirit that was animating them will continue to feed this discussion. There's always a question, why are we here and what is it that we want to achieve? I want to highlight one thing. There are many reasons why we're here, but let me mention a few. There is a sense of powerlessness sometimes in front of the amplitude of the questions that we're facing. There is also a fear, let's be frank, that we might in the end kill the benefits of the internet by trying to fix it. There is also a need, as I said earlier, to step back from the pressure of urgency, because what is being done, constantly patching the problems that have just emerged a couple of days before, is not a solution that is lasting long term. But fundamentally, there's one thing that I want to highlight. This is the belief that the people in this room and in the policy network share something that is not often highlighted, that is not often clarified, but it is this deep belief that we need to reconcile competing objectives, namely that we want to collectively fight abuses, at the same time defend, develop, and protect human rights, and at the same time make sure that we enable the digital economy and the cloud economy. And reconciling those three objectives is a very difficult, is a very ambitious goal, but I think this is something that unites the people in this room. And so fundamentally, the bottom line is these are legal problems, these are economic questions, these are human rights related questions, these are security questions. But overall, I think what is at stake is a fundamental question of what is the digital society that we want to build together, and what kind of governance should it have. And you collectively in this room and the participants in the policy network, you represent, as Paul said, a critical mass of actors. You have the power, if working together, to basically shape the future of digital governance, to preserve the global nature of the internet and its benefit, and catalyze change. Nobody else can do it if you don't do it, and you cannot do it alone either. This is why the network is intended to grow, that it will reach out to other actors and engage them to be as inclusive as possible. But this is a very important message regarding the capacity to actually address those issues and create the solutions that we need.
And I would like to add to this that after a long period of not addressing these issues, things have recently accelerated. 1.5 years after the first global conference of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, we all here in this room are now witnessing an increasing spread and proliferation of public and private initiatives in many parts of the world. And many of you here in the room are actually leading them. This is a priori a very positive signal. But we also need to collectively acknowledge that measures taken today under great pressure and urgency, and that those measures are also taken often, unfortunately, in an uncoordinated manner. To avoid illegal arms race and prevent losing the benefits of the cross-border internet, we need to take one step back. It is clear that we are now beyond problem framing. But what is now required are actually two things. It is one, policy coherence between the multiplicity of initiatives, between the policy silos of digital economy, human rights and security that Bertrand mentioned. And two, joint action. Joint action to develop the necessary frameworks that can deal with the transnational nature of the internet.
I think I don't want to delay much longer the start of the session dedicated precisely to policy coherence. There are a few things that I will be happy to insert into this discussion afterwards, but I think we've spoken, we've put the things on track, and I think it's time to actually launch the session on policy coherence.
Absolutely. And in order, or before we start this session, maybe for those who were already in Paris, they are accustomed to this very innovative format of the global conferences of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Networks. But for those who are here for the first time, let me quickly explain how this works. This plenary session is organized in two parts with a break in between. We as the Secretariat have pre-selected a few discussants, but we not only invite, but we encourage all of you here in this room to take the floor. All intervention times are strictly limited to 3 minutes, and please, you can take the floor again, but the limit is 3 minutes. In order to take the floor, it is very easy. You raise the hand, the microphone will come to your place. We would like you to please stand up, say your name, tell us with whom you are here today, and please respect the time limit. To kickstart this plenary session, a couple of questions. One is the fundamental one that we would like to ask you again. Why are you here? Why have you taken 4, 5, 6 days out of your incredibly busy agendas to come here to Ottawa? How does the notion of policy coherence resonate with you, your experience, your perspective from your entity that you're representing here? What do we all need to keep in mind when we go tomorrow into the different work streams to refine the work plans? In short, what do we want to achieve here in Ottawa together? With this, I would like to introduce our first discussant of this section. Andrew Wyckoff is the director of the Directorate for Science, Technology and Innovation of the OECD, which is also one of the institutional supporters of this conference. Andy, you have the floor.
Thank you, Paul, and certainly want to thank you and the Internet and Jurisdiction group. The reason we're here is I think we very much share a mission with you to try to bridge the gaps. I also want to thank the Canadian government for organizing this conference and inviting us. I was in something close to this room about 20 years ago with the so-called Ottawa e-commerce ministerial, which was really, for me, the beginning to some extent of a cross-border discussion on many of these themes, and all about enabling the global digital economy. That meeting enshrined the multi-stakeholder approach to some extent, and it was a very early days, and we came away with a light-handed regulatory approach. It was expected that advances in market forces and technology and wise policy would prevail. You know, and by and large, we've gotten there. As Vint was just saying, it is amazing that we're just about to cross the threshold of half of the population having access to the internet and applications like hypertext and World Wide Web. Crossing this threshold is significant. I just want to pause for a second with a little bit of mathematics. Many of you know Metcalfe's law, which states the value of the network is the square of the number of connected users. So even though the internet is only about middle age, in the last decade, its value increased by a factor of 4. I wish I could say the same myself. But that's only a proxy. How does one really measure the value of the global flow and the free flow of data across networks and borders? This is difficult, and I think we need this evidence base to advance some of the discussions we're having here today and over the next few days. This is far from straightforward. Data flows are deeply intertwined with basically everything that goes across the border, whether it be migrants, trade, foreign direct investment. Some cases we have direct measures of digitalized services that have a value associated with them. That's easy. But data, by and large, is the connecting tissue and the nervous system of our global economy, and a lot of these things go unmeasured and unvalued. Now, in a study that we prepared for the 2016 Cancun Ministerial, we got some data from large companies for which we're very thankful. For example, we found that 60% of Google searches originate in one country, but actually go to the top-level domain of another. This is an anecdote, and that supports our intuition and a lot of the things we believe in this room, but these are snapshots. We need to move beyond this to the movie to understand the dynamic evolution of the economy and why this data is important. 10 seconds. First, we need it for 3 reasons. To establish the social and economic benefits. We believe in them, but we really don't have a value. Second, some jurisdictions, for maybe legitimate reasons, want to control these, but what's the cost of this action of shutting it down? We don't really know. And thirdly, some companies can afford this, others can't. What is the cost they're encountering? With that, let me just end with a plea for a little bit more systematic collection and one of the work streams going forward to help us establish this so that countries and other actors know the cost of what they're doing.
Thank you very much. This is a very important point that you raised, Andy. Our next discussant will be Uri Rosenthal. Uri Rosenthal is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. You have the floor.
Thank you. No compliments because it takes time. First, why I'm here to connect. And that's serious business. Second, my goodness, policy coherence. Policy coherence. My goodness. Nevertheless, compliments for one point, that you are, although we are sitting here in circles, you are definitely doing some forward mapping, and I like that. And you're going for solutions, and I like that as well. Please connect, I would say, and connect to 1. The London process, started by William Hague in 2010. Why? Because he said to me, I was then an acting minister, he said to me and other colleagues, it's high time that we raise the level of awareness to the political level. I would like to see as many politicians as possible involved in this. Second, the Freedom Online Coalition, established in 2011. 35 countries, like-minded. Please connect. Third, the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, both North and South involved. Multi-Stakeholder, very important, I would say. Fourth, not the least, the present and working Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. Henriette Esterhuis is here, David Martinon is here. We are going for concrete steps, and here you have it. You can get it. It's a call to protect the public core of the internet. An offer nobody could refuse, I would say. Very simple. Then, when we talk the London process, it's multi-stakeholder. It is the triangle you already mentioned, which is open and secure internet, both on the security and the safety side, which is quite a different thing. And thirdly, please don't give away the opportunities of the internet for social growth, social development, and economic growth. Last but not least, Vint Cerf said in the Financial Times, it's a chance that should not be missed. I don't want to be dramatic, but he already mentioned Shakespeare. I would say to be or not to be. And if you want to have a more melodious kind of thing, Elvis Presley's Now or Never. Thank you.
I just want to highlight immediately on the comments that you made that the different processes that you're mentioning are clearly things that are in the landscape and we're interacting with. For instance, Katherine Gettau is somebody that we met at the GCCS meeting in Delhi. The Freedom Online Coalition is something that we've been closely involved in, and I think no. Quite on the contrary, it's endorsing fully what you're saying, to highlight that the methodology is precisely to identify all the different initiatives and processes, and you will see that on the third day, it's one of the objectives to identify things that we have not mapped yet. It's not a defensive at all. Thank you.
With this, I would like to give the floor to our next discussant. Gail Kent is the Global Public Policy Manager at Facebook. Could we please get a microphone?
Yeah,
yes,
I've got
perfect.
it. And the reason I'm here is, as many of you who've worked with me for a long time know, this is what I've spent most of my career looking at. And latterly at Facebook. You will all know that there is not a day goes by, I'm sure in all of your countries, where we do not make a mistake on terms of like content takedown or where we are providing data or not providing data. I'm not going to give you examples because I'm sure that you've all got them in your head. And this is something that you will understand that we do not think that we should have our own responsibility for, and we absolutely support the idea that there is a multi-stakeholder process that can come up with some solutions, both on content, which is one of the big issues that we are facing on a daily basis, but also in the area that interests me most, which is sort of access to data for law enforcement. What we find every day, though, is that we are absolutely at the crux of governments contradicting themselves. So policy coherence for us is absolutely critical. I have been in too many meetings where I have got a government asking me to take down content. I've then got the next person asking me to provide data to law enforcement, and the next person, who might be the data protection officer, asking me to make sure that none of this data is available to anybody else. And sometimes it feels like, as the big companies, and I'm sure the same is true of Google as well, we're the only ones that are dealing with this contradiction every day. So my biggest plea is exactly as Bertrand and Paul have asked us to look for, is policy coherence. I'd echo the other speakers in that we know how complicated this is. We know the detail of thought that is going into this area and has gone into the discussion over the last, well, Bertrand has talked about 6 years. I'd say sort of like 10, 15 is getting more and more complicated. And we need to come up with solutions that deal with that level of contradiction nationally and internationally. And just as Cathy Brown and Matthew Parris said, and I'm going to echo them as well, we need now is also the time to break through. We know that every day we have national governments producing solutions, presenting laws, and asking Facebook and other companies to follow them. We know that there isn't a time for a huge amount of discussion to come up with what the best solution is right now. But we also need we need to be focusing whatever we're doing, and Cathy, I couldn't agree with you more in terms of looking at the people and looking how this affects users and not just machines around the world. But I also echo the need for transparency and for the availability and the consistency of what we're doing. So my biggest plea is that we use this conference to come up with a framework that people like me can use to decide what laws are good and what are bad around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gail, and also for setting a perfect example, because you were on the second for the 3 minutes. With this, before we continued with sort of the prepared discussions, now's the moment where we would like to already open up the to the rest of the room. I would like to invite everybody now to please contribute to this discussion, and raise your hand, please. Who wants to go first? Well.
This is actually a minor niche, Yuri. It turns out that while Metcalfe made the claim that the value of the net was the function of n squared, it's actually n log n, and there's a reason for that. We can't possibly meet everybody in the world and have benefit from that. At best, we might meet log n of them, and so it's really n log n, which is still a damn good proposition.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Who would like to be next? It's always difficult. Yes, behind us here. Can we have a microphone, please, here? Thank you.
My name is May Ann. I'm from Singapore. I'm representing the Asia Cloud Computing Association. My comment is actually to Andrew regarding the statistics. The Asia Cloud Computing Association produces a biannual report called the Cloud Readiness Index. And usually what I get is questions from journalists coming in and asking me, hey man, you're an expert in cloud computing. What is the adoption of cloud in Asia, as opposed to Europe, as opposed to America? Exactly, thank you for that expression. Yeah. Usually I'm on the phone, I'm like, seriously, what are you talking about? Do you mean the number of Gmail users or Dropbox users? We have a problem with that, and with a lot of the work that I do with ASEAN and with APEC, we're working towards moving and mapping out a way that we develop the digital economy, but without measures to map out where the digital economy currently is, we can't map a way forward. To give you an example, I'm just on the cusp of releasing the Cloud Readiness Index 2018. China ranks number 13 out of 14. India ranks 12 out of 14. That makes no sense. Right now, I think about 2 weeks ago, China just announced that it was building, I kid you not, building an island to test drone ships. And I'm thinking, okay, how can they be number 13 out of 14 if they're building drones? We need better statistics. I don't know how we're going to be doing that, because I think that there are statistics that are market measured, meaning that you go out and do surveys. But I feel that the World Bank, the ITU, the WEF, I think we need to map a way forward to collect these globally, and not just OECD, not just within Asia, but globally, so that we can map a way forward, because we can't improve what we can't measure.
And maybe I would just like to add something. I think this is a fundamental point, and it can be summarized with this question: how can we measure the economic cost of inaction? And I think this is a major challenge. And we have talked to a number of organizations who have the brain power to actually do those sort of things. It is a challenge, but I believe that is fundamental that is done, so that those policy discussions we're having here are also informed by those numbers. The next intervention is over there. If we could please have a microphone. And just before you start, you can raise your hand even while someone is speaking. I would try to write down the speaking order and give you the floor afterwards.
Thank you, Paul. Steve Del Bianco with NetChoice. To create the time and space for us to have coherent solutions, we need to, as Bertrand indicated, avoid being trapped by the urgency of solving the most immediate problem that was in yesterday's papers and is on the lips of every legislator and lawmaker in the world. As one who tries to do this in Washington and state capitals in the US, I find that it's completely ineffective to answer urgency by pleas for caution, coherence, comprehensive solutions. That will get us nowhere. I think we need to understand that the rhetorical response to urgency is counter-urgency. As a lawmaker is lamenting an urgent problem that needs to be solved, our rhetoric in response is to show the unintended or perhaps intended consequences of their actions and the urgency of how that would destroy values they hold dear. To show that a sweeping fine on every bot would capture automated placement that campaigns themselves use or that public safety officials use. To answer claims that restrictions on all political advertising would cover issues like global warming and the preservation of natural resources, since that's all political. In other words, concrete examples that are both immediately and real, as well as potential and highly plausible, are the necessary response to slow down the urgency of trying to solve a so-called abuse problem with a solution that impairs human rights, free expression, and actually undermines the opportunity for the digital economy. So those kind of examples we're going to need for media, for lawmakers, and for courts if we're going to succeed at creating the space for coherence.
Thank you very much. Who would like to go next? If no one is yes, over there, please.
John Curran, President and CEO, ARIN, the American Registry for Internet Numbers. When it comes to policy coherence, if we think about the purpose of the activities we're doing here, we have a situation where we have a very challenging problem in front of us to try to create standards, norms, models that allow us cooperatively, states and internet actors, to work together to better outcomes. The internet is very complex, and so when we begin to look at how the pillars of this activity, the work streams, content and data and domains interact, it's probably best to look at the most lengthy, most complex situation, and then realize that it's the simplicity that is provided in some places but not in others. If indeed we were in a world where we all knew content X was bad, and we had mutually, through some panel, decided content X has to be taken down, consider the fact that we are going to be creating norms and standards that talk about not going to the person responsible for the content and having him remove it, but going to some intermediary along the path. Now, this literally can be involving, at the far end, the user, but it could be that he's on a content platform. That content platform could be a discussion board. It could be hosted on a cloud provider. So now we've got the user, the discussion board, the cloud provider. The cloud provider's in a data center. The data center is hooked up to multiple ISPs. That is all being served off a domain name. So there is a domain name registry and registrar involved. All of that's being served across access pipes. There's a CDN involved. And at the far end, there's a user who's accessing it via resolvers and browsers. There's a lot of intermediaries here. And so folks have to realize the moment we get away from the person who actually owns the content, the one who's attributed, the actual actor, if we had him, that would be the place to solve it, but we don't. And so we need to be very careful, because the lack of attribution is causing us to work with someone else in the chain. People who cooperate with getting to the source need to be able to be not part of the activities we're doing. People who say, I can't cooperate, inherently have to be part of the conversation about how to get that content, because we can't get back to the original actor. And it's important to think about the long case of all those parties involved, because that's all the people who we may be approaching to get involved in content. The domains is a subset. The data, a special case of more information. But the whole chain is very complicated, and it's a lot more than just one social media platform or one content platform. There's a lot of providers in the path. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. With this, I would like to continue with our selected discussants here. I would like to give the floor to Joseph CANNATACI, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you, Bertrand, for inviting me here, and to the Canadian government for supporting me, my participation here. I'm here because from the very first day of my mandate as UN Special Rapporteur for Privacy, I've pointed out the problem with the gaps in the legal framework internationally, the problems in international law. And so many people before have spoken about norms, which is a polite way to say rules. And of course, had we had the rules for the internet been there, we wouldn't be here in the room. And probably Bertrand and Paul would be out of business if we've sorted out all the problems we had. It's because of this that last month, 2 months ago actually, I intervened as amicus curiae in the Microsoft case in the which is being heard by the United States Court, the Supreme Court this week, precisely to try and persuade the court to rule very narrowly in order not to let the United States government off the hook of the necessity to negotiate internationally. Because what we need here is international law. What we need here is to plug the gaps in the legal framework. It's what we've been trying to do in my mandate by discussing openly for the past 2 years with most of the stakeholders involved, including the companies, including secret services, including law enforcement, trying to discuss an international legal instrument which could help regulate surveillance and privacy. Because the truth is, at this moment in time, and this is what Minister McGovern's words prompted me to think, we need to get real. It's all good to talk about a whole lot of platitudes, but the reality is that privacy and many other human rights, security and surveillance are currently off the table when it comes to many stakeholders who are governments. Those governments don't wish to discuss surveillance and privacy. They don't wish to discuss it in the context of security. They've tried discussing it, but I find that many of them are battle weary. Paul and Bertrand were talking about trust, but there is, at this moment in time, one of the major problems, as I see it, is that the trust and goodwill are evaporating because of the difficulties that governments have had in discussing with each other. So, problem number one, how to get privacy and security and surveillance on the table for those stakeholders, which are the governments. Number two, when it comes to looking forward to the next 2 days, 3 days, I would like to see privacy being there in each of the streams to have it part of the design of the solution. Privacy by design has become too much of a watchword, but I wish you well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With this, I would like to give the floor to Maria Pascanayes, who's the Executive Director of Derechos Digitales.
Thank you. I am privileged to be representing here the work of civil society organization in the Global South. I think that it's evident the effort that the organization made to bring us here, and we are very grateful for that. And with that being said, I'm going to be a little bit provocative because I was invited to be provocative. So I will start saying that I fundamentally disagree with something that Bertrand just said a few minutes ago, in the sense that addressing abuses, enabling digital economy, and respecting human rights are contradictory objectives. I fundamentally disagree because I think that they are totally complementary, and that you cannot have a real protection of a human rights exercise if you're not able to address abuses on the internet, and if you are not able to provide that the benefit of the digital economy gets to everyone, especially to the ones that are being traditionally underrepresented in different spaces. So in that sense, I would like to highlight also something that the ministry from Kenya said also a few minutes ago, in the sense that we need to care about how users can have a fair share of what are the business models that have been developed to exploit the benefit of the network. So with that being said, I want to say that a lot of have been discussed already in the comments of the presenters before me about the necessary coherence in the policy that are pushed by government, but I would like to highlight that the same coherence is necessary from the standards and policies that are implemented by private companies, which are the ones that are getting the services to the users. And in that sense, I think that even we have had in recent times a huge step in providing more coherence through commitments of transparency of the companies. Probably we are now at the stage in which we need like a better effort than just like commit to provide more information about how the decisions are made, but also make the users part of the decision making. And when I am talking about this, I am talking this in two different senses. One moment when the rules are set by private actors, and after how they are applying those rules. I think that the time has come, and probably civil society organizations are a good potential partner for undergoing in this way, and help to provide this more insight about how the users want to be not only the passive destinatory of standards that are created by private actors, but have more agency in how the decisions are made, in the sense in which all these services in some way frame the daily life of many people around the world. So I think that also it's something that it will help to overcome a very difficult task that is part of the mission of this group of people that we are talking about, internet and jurisdiction, which is to set the problem of how we have global standards, but at the same time global standards that are able to account for the diversity of the local context. In that sense, we have to acknowledge that general standard can be very good in the sensibility that it can have for providing coherence in the policy, but the application of common standard can fail to account for different political, social, and economic contexts, and the same rules can have very unfair results in different people around the globe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Abdul Salam Waiswa from the Uganda Communications Commission. Uganda is in East Africa, for those who are not very sure. Thank you very much for this engagement. It's very critical for us. In Uganda, just like most parts of Africa, we are benefiting a lot from internet. But alongside the benefits, we're also facing a lot of abuse. And yes, I've had a discussion that we are setting the norms and the practices. But one fact that we need to understand is that different parts of the world, the users of the internet have different kind of behaviors. Maybe in the Western world, people are disciplined. So they understand that for me to benefit from the internet, I must be responsible. So whatever I post must be accountable. I must be able to defend it. And I must be responsible by avoiding attacking other people, by not being offensive, by not being very political, by not using the internet to attack other business interests. Now, in my country, there is a common practice of people opening up accounts specifically on Facebook, and then they use pseudonyms. And they use those accounts to attack governments, to attack other business operators. And now the challenge is the service providers, and I'm glad there's somebody from Facebook. Do we have any deliberate attempt to ensure that all people who are opening accounts on our platforms do not use pseudonyms? Because when you allow people using pseudonyms, then you are giving them the cloud to attack others, to abuse, to be offensive, and misuse the internet without being accountable. I believe where there is accountability, there will be responsibility. So what measures do operators like Facebook have in place to ensure that they do not allow people to open accounts using pseudonyms? I think that is very critical, and it's one of the main reasons why I've come all the way from Uganda, 18 hours to come and learn, because every day I prosecute for the government on internet abuse-related cases, but it's one of the issues we are dealing with in my country. So I would love this meeting to provide answers on how the rest of you are dealing with that, and also the promise from the internet service providers and social media platforms like WhatsApp, Facebook, on how use of pseudonyms can be avoided in order to allow accountability and openness in order for us to benefit from the internet. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So as this was a direct question and debate to Guy Kent, I believe, Guy, you have 1 minute to respond before we continue with the speaking queue.
And then Henriette wants
We can also discuss this outside. What I would say is that Uganda is not unique in having users who will attack governments and who have disagreements over issues online. There is, however, and we see a variety of approaches to how that is dealt with around the world, and I think that comes to sort of human rights and one of the discussions we're going to debate here. We have a real name policy on Facebook, but I'm sure one of the other issues that we'll discuss over the next couple of days is anonymity and the right to anonymity online, because that is certainly something that is really important to other governments around the world. But very happy to follow up specifically on some Ugandan issues.
Henriette, is it on this? Okay, so 1 minute as well for you, and then Thomas Fitchen and Vint, is it on this as well? Okay.
Thank you for raising that. I think that's a really useful way of illustrating how challenging policy coherence is, and that it also involves at times shifts having to be made by governments, actually. So on the one hand, it's important that policy and solutions we develop recognizes the specificity and the different capacities of different countries, but they also need, in order to be coherent, look at existing international human rights agreements, in existing standards, which those countries, including Uganda, are also needing to find ways to comply with. So it is very challenging. It's not trivial, but it also requires shifts. The companies need to be responsive, but states also need to remember what their obligations are with regard to particularly protecting rights. And privacy, anonymity, these are critical. So I look forward to more discussion on that. It's not easy, but it shouldn't be.
There will be a very good coffee break discussion. You can get on the table and come back with a solution afterwards. Vint, you want to chime in as well, 1 minute, and then Thomas Fitch.
So a couple of points. First of all, I've discovered that there are a number of Vint Cerf impersonators that are on Facebook. You and I need to talk about that. And none of them are me. I'm not faking myself. But this does raise a really interesting question. People do have the same names. That's one point. Second, how would you establish that you are that person with that name? I mean, we could imagine onerous practices like having to show IDs before you could get an account. But it occurs to me that we might ask ourselves, is anonymity a privacy right? I mean, should we equate those or not? And I don't know the answer to that, but it's a very interesting conundrum.
So I think, Martin, was it on that topic? Okay, just another minute, and we will resume the queue, because this is a discussion that can go for quite long. It's an important one, but go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Maarten Bottemon. No, just to illustrate and just confirm, global issues are complex, because what works in one country doesn't work in another. And it's not for no reason that also the internet community has committed to building things like the Onion router, which has done a lot of good and has been a tool for bad. And that's true for everything we do. Yet it is true that in some countries, if you are to expose yourself with your full identity, you'll be subject to prosecution, to murder attacks by governments or other organizations. So there is some key need. Would we want to prevent people that seek that way to express themselves to not use the internet anymore? I think that would be a great limitation.
Thank you very much. Thomas, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thomas Fitchen from the German Federal Foreign Office. Why have I come here? First of all, I wanted to reassure Yuri Rosenthal that actually Paul and Bertrand do cooperate with the coalition, Freedom Online Coalition. Germany has the chair this year, so I'm here and follow this work. Second, I wanted to report back on our activities since the Paris conference, namely the resolutions that we have introduced with a group of supporters, both in the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, where we have managed to get in some language on transparency. That was an issue that we discussed last year. And also we have moved into putting up some language on the role and responsibility of the private sector. So this is moving. I'm not saying this to brag about the resolutions, and language is indeed a lot better than the CSTD. But the point is that in the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, we were able to come up with consensus language. That included, of course, the delegations of Kenya and Uganda and other countries. It included the United States, Canada for that matter, Russia and China and the whole of the EU, everyone. Those were consensus resolutions. So there we have a framework of language outside our INJ project. It may be very subtle, it may not be very far-reaching, but at least we do have language that we can all quote. And somebody said earlier, well, governments are not coherent. Here you have language that you can quote and pull out whenever you talk to any government representatives, because that is something that your government has agreed to. So in a way, you can hold that government representative accountable in some way. Diplomacy at the UN is mostly the art of cross-referencing, so this is one of the opportunities you have, looking at these documents, looking at the text that everyone has agreed to, and then using it also in your discourse here at INJ. Thank you very much.
Yes, Uri Rosenthal would like to respond. Uri, if we can have a microphone over there. You have 1 minute before we continue.
Well, no, I'm not going on the defensive on my side, but I would like to pick up your message about common language. Let me say what struck me after being working as a special envoy for nearly 3 years. Only then I realized that people talking about the economic growth, social development, opportunities of the internet are talking the word digital. And many are talking, when they talk cyber, they immediately only think about security. So there is something to do about that as well. You know, it's very specific and it actually reinforces your point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next person raised the hand over there. Can we please have a microphone? There was Lee from...
Lee Tuthill with the World Trade Organization. Obviously, from the name of my organization.
Can you maybe...
Sure. I wasn't raised in a school where you stand up to speak, but I'm happy to. Obviously, the name of my organization means that the reason I've come, and I thank you for inviting me, is because the WTO is looking very much at the economic implications of the internet and the benefits that can accrue for trade, for development, and all forms of commerce. What I find extremely impressive about the work that's been done so far in looking at all the documentation is that I can see the potential for organizations such as the WTO to see these as a cross-reference, I think was a perfect word for it, and as case studies for if you can come up with reasonable and workable ways to get something accomplished and some agreement on what is the best way forward, then that could laterally spread out into how some other issues are handled. Right now at the WTO, people are thinking that everything is just too big and complex to take advantage of the ability for people to collaborate. I think that's not impossible. I would be carrying back to the people I work with some of the things that have gone on here, but I also saw in the documentation principles that are very, very dear to the WTO, such as proportionality and necessity, such as transparency and reasonableness. And I think that, so there is cross-fertilization there in terms of principles that we can leverage onto the internet at some future point when people are comfortable that they're not talking at cross purposes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next one, please here. Can we have a microphone for Christina?
Thank you. Thank you. I would also like to offer some general remarks on the role of governments and the challenges they face, and why also we think as European Commission initiatives like this one are particularly useful and important. So, as some already mentioned, the governments need to encourage digital growth and development, and at the same time they have to take on board different needs. For instance, as regards privacy and human rights versus access to information and unhindered flow of data. They also have to respond to cybercrime, and for instance, recent terrorist attacks in Europe put additional pressure for finding quick fixes, so governments are in this situation. They also have pressures to define some standards for businesses and service providers in the absence of global rules. For instance, when they have to deal with competition issues and disruption of old business models. So governments, as protectors of the public interest and the rule of law, and as the main actors in international relations, certainly have an important role to play in this context. But they are really challenged. They are challenged by the increasing complexity of the contemporary world and by the pace of technological development. As we know, state involvement is not always compatible with the initial governance model of the internet, which was primarily led by the technical community. And it is not often, it's not compatible with the open internet itself. But being aware of this risk and the current situation that we face, how can we move forward? In my view, there is a need to overcome policy silos. As we heard, different parts of the governments can have different interests or different needs in mind, and we need to overcome that. We need to be more innovative in policy makings, and we need stronger cooperation also with other stakeholders. The European Commission is a strong supporter of the multi-stakeholder model, which in our view is the only way to move forward and find solutions together with all relevant stakeholders. However, this model is still questioned by many, and we can expect that the temptation for state-only action will only increase, including in the European Union. Trust in the model is also put to the test by the fact that there is a perception that an increasingly smaller number of players dominate with their technical know-how, access to data, and regulatory power. So in this context, we think initiatives like this one are particularly important, and as the European Commission, we are really looking forward to contribute. We think we have a lot to offer in order to ensure an open, free, and safe internet. We have strong foundations, for instance, in terms of the GDPR, strong net neutrality rules, the Network and Information Security Directive, strong safeguards for consumer protection, liability regime, and we think that all these elements can really contribute to the way forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This was Cristina Monti from the European Commission. Please always state your name and your organization when you start, just a reminder. The next one is please over there, you have the floor. Mokhtar Yedali from the African Union Commission.
The camera doesn't see me. Ah, no, it sees me now. The fact that I'm speaking, my name is Mokhtar Yedali. I'm the head of the Information Society within the African Union Commission. And the fact that I'm speaking after European Union Commission is not coordinated, just facts. It's, although we have a lot of things in common within the African Union and the European Union Commissions. Now, first of all, I would like to thank you for having us here. And I'm very, very happy to see that many Africans have spoken before me. Kati and representative from Uganda and Harriet. People tend to forget that she's an African. But this is to underline something very important with the fact that Africa now must and should be part of this discussion related to internet in general and specifically with regard to the jurisdictions. Because ICTs and specifically internet represent the unique opportunity for Africans actually to leapfrog into the 21st century and change the way they are actually developing themselves. And we could not allow ourselves to have those barriers with regard to development of internet and the use of ICT within our countries. Because what has been said by certain previous speakers, the challenges we are having with regard to jurisdictions may stop some or have certain government stopping the use of ICT properly, and therefore using internet for our prosperity would be actually a very, very good challenge. So the African Union business is actually to make sure that the policy and regulation within the continent are well harmonized. And therefore, with regard to matters on privacy and cybercrimes and personal data protection, we have a convention called Malabo Convention, the Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection. And until recently, we were working with ISOC to develop guidelines on the personal data protection. And the issue of privacy is actually become one of the issues that we need to address. And that, therefore, the issue of Facebook, the social media, and those things that are happening are actually very well put in the framework of our discussion. I see my time is up, but I will be continuing after to develop this series of ideas that Africa is developing with regard to the cybersecurity, with regard to the personal data protection, with regard to internet governance. We have a lot of programs that are done with the European Union, and we would like to emphasize that after. But I hope that I will get the floor after.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mokhtar. The next intervention is just behind me, and I'm always looking behind me if people raise their hand.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Daniel Holznagel, I'm from Germany, from the Ministry of Justice. I would just like to reject a little bit certain points that I heard, or maybe not reject, just offer a different perspective. And what I mean is that, Gail Kent, you said most crucial is coherence between national states, or what I heard was we need to slow down the search for a solution. Of course, the opposite. Okay. No, that I heard somewhere else here in the audience. Yeah. What I want to say, okay, this might be true, but at least in the field where I'm responsible for accountability of intermediaries, if we are looking for perfect coherence or slow down the search, please keep in mind that the law in this area is kind of frozen for 20 years, and if we look for perfect coherence, we will never find a solution, maybe. Of course, it is the best if we all move forward together, but somehow we also should keep this in mind that we can take steps, and sometimes at a national level. Which brings me to another point that was mentioned. What is the cost if a single country takes action? I think Mr. Wyckoff made this point. I want to say to this point, maybe think about what is the benefit if one country takes action, especially if we are in a field where it seems like impossible for all of us to move together. So, or even for people working in a big company like Facebook or so on, maybe sometimes you need one country to step forward, to go to your CEO and say, look what this country did, I think we need to move on here, and then you prevent national laws in different countries. So what I want to say, of course, it's perfect if we can move together, all together coherent, but maybe we also need to move together. Maybe we need this looming danger that national states, of course, will always be able to do something to step forward on their own. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next one in the queue is here, Kathy Brown. If we could please have a microphone.
Thank you, Kathy Brown, the Internet Society. I feel a little bit of a disconnect in the room that I just want to point out because I am for a breakthrough here, and I'm worried. Here's the disconnect that I feel. There is an urgency on the part of some to say that we can get a coherent and I'm not sure. If you're saying framework, then I'm feeling better. But if what you're saying is a process and procedure that everyone is going to adopt because we're all going to adopt it, I want to push back just a little bit. And I've learned from my friend Mokhtar and Demi and others who are themselves trying to figure out how to put frameworks in charge on very big continents, by the way. There are very big continents other than the North America. There's South America, there's Africa with many countries. And what I have learned from their good advice and wisdom is that we would do well with frameworks. That if we develop frameworks that have fundamental pieces to them, and then we're able to take it through the commissions, through the various coalitions of countries that are willing to test those frameworks, then we don't go to the lowest common denominator. We don't want that. We do want a principled framework, and then it's okay if 1,000 flowers bloom. In fact, that's what we want. We need actually both joint action, but also we need distributed action. I want to keep reminding people, the internet is a distributed and diverse ecosystem where we could agree to certain fundamental pieces of a framework, but then we've got to allow the thing to work itself out in the very cultures and the very legal frameworks that are already there. Now, I would then push back on where the legal frameworks are oppressive, do not meet these requirements, and that's a whole other issue that we have to pursue. But where you have this kind of goodwill that I feel is in this room, I think you have to start with framework. A framework that you allow for some agility and for some flexibility and experimentation around. Thank you for allowing me to just put that piece in.
Thank you very much. As Facebook was mentioned previously, we give Gail 1 minute to respond to the remarks.
I agree with everything that Kathy's just said. Where I'm not saying that that individual governments shouldn't be producing laws, but I think what would be incredibly useful is a framework that enables us to then say this is good, this works. And believe me, there are some fantastic examples of where legislation does enable us to move forward, but there are also some examples, and I'm sure you know how controversial Next DG is, in terms of where there is a sense that without this sort of framework, it's very difficult for companies and for others to judge whether this is a step forward or a step backwards.
Thank you very much, Gail. We're now closing the queue for this segment with the last speaker, that is Bertrand, who also raised his hand. I noted down everybody else, so there's a queue for when we resume after the break. Bertrand.
Yeah, thank you. Just quickly on the topic that has been mentioned, we are touching here a very interesting formulation, which is the danger of the search for perfection, and the question of how many actors initiate a regime or framework, and how many are discussing it, and how many should be part of it, and how much unilateral actions should be done. It's a very important discussion, and I want you to keep in mind this question for the further segment. But as we're mapping in a certain way the different dimensions of policy coherence, I want to inject 3 elements. One is something that has been touched already by Matthew Prince, which is the question of same rules for very different situations, or not. There is a diversity of actors by size, by functions, by location. Even the location and the way the different companies store data is leading to a completely different legal regime in the US between Google and Microsoft regarding the warrants, because the way they store the data has different consequences when it goes to the court. This is an element of coherence that has to be taken into account. And it goes also for the places in the technical chain that was mentioned before. The second thing is a word that we haven't used yet, but that I want to highlight, which is the term of scalability. And scalability in terms of policy coherence brings two questions, in my view, that we should have in mind when we discuss this. The one is when one actor, private or public, adopts something to patch or to find a solution, how well does it scale? Can it be easily adopted by other actors? Can it grow organically, a little bit like the internet has grown, from a core number of actors at the beginning, and it looks like a good practice, and it then becomes the accepted practice? That's a question, and that should be a goal. But there is a second dimension, and without or being a little bit pedantic, for those of you who are familiar with the notion of the categorical imperative of Immanuel Kant, there's a fundamental question. If you are contemplating an idea or a measure, and you try mentally to imagine what would happen if everybody were doing the same, and in particular whether it would be harming you in return, then you probably shouldn't consider it in the first place. So this notion of policy coherence is a second dimension, is the mental, it's not impact assessment, but there's a bit of an impact assessment there. It's how does it scale? And in this regard, there's a term that the internet community uses a lot, which I think is important, which is genericity. How flexible, to take Kathy's concept of framework, how flexible can any regime or any measure be in terms of accommodating a diversity of situations? And the final element that I want to insert in this before the break and the picture is the term extraterritoriality. International sovereignty is historically attached very strongly to territoriality. We are in an environment, and we will discuss that further, where clearly extraterritoriality is becoming a tool. And it is not that there's a bad thing and a good thing. There are cases where extraterritoriality is appropriate and cases where it's not. The key question in terms of policy coherence goes again to the Kantian imperative of, if I extend my legislation beyond my territory, is it likely to be replicated by everybody else and then create more problems than solving the problems? And you have different ways of doing this. You can have a transborder impact or an extraterritorial impact almost involuntarily because you're applying your national laws on a national operator who is serving actually actors beyond the borders. So this notion of extraterritoriality actually is a thread that goes across the different discussions we have here on jurisdiction. And I just wanted to insert this here because it is, with the two other elements of scalability and different situations, a portion of the map of what policy coherence is about. And the notion of committee, which was a little bit a forgotten concept or not sufficiently addressed concept, is going, I think, to have a great future in this environment. With that, Paul, we have a picture now.
Exactly. Now comes the part where we are going to take, just before the very, very important coffee break. Coffee is incredibly important, especially if we expect to really progress here together in the policy network. But before we have the coffee break to be ready for the second part of this plenary session, I would like to invite everybody to please go outside. Our amazing volunteers are there to guide you and help you. We will go on the ramp that is just on the other side. We will quickly line up for a picture. And the faster we are and the more efficient we are, the sooner the coffee break will start. Thank you very much. Thank you. So this was a great first start for the second Global Internet and Jurisdiction Conference. There are still some discussants from the first part of the plenary session that are lined up in the queue. I took proper note of that. Before we come to them, I would like to start this session with David Martinon, who is the Ambassador for Digital Affairs of the Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France. And we are, of course, particularly grateful to the government of France for having been the partner for the first Global Internet and Jurisdiction Conference. If we could please have a microphone for David.
Merci. Thank you, Bertrand and Paul. I was prepared to speak last, so I need to improvise, and I have absolutely no idea about what I'm going to say. No, having said that, I just wanted to thank you again. I know it's going to take me some time, but what you have been doing for years is extremely useful. And I say that because, yes, you have been facilitating a very rich dialogue. And I must say that this is why I'm here, by the way. The policy options documents that you've provided us are very rich, again, very useful. And following what you both have said, I would be very inclined to say now is probably the best time to do something more decisive. And I think it's the right time for Internet and jurisdiction to actually propose solutions on the three topics that you've identified. And I say that because other reason why I'm here, I have been tasked by the president with at least 2 missions, notably 2 missions, one of them being how to ease access to data for criminal investigators and prosecutors. 18 months ago, 2 police officers, a couple of police officers were assassinated in their home, in front of their 3-year-old child. And the prosecutor who is working on the case is still expecting the data he needs to finish the investigation. So I have read what has been written, I have heard everybody. What about trying to invent the sort of arrangement that would fit or try to fit everybody, and in which most of us would feel comfortable enough to make the kind of progress we need? That would be a fantastic political goal for Internet and jurisdiction. Having said that, it would need to be quick, because in weeks, maybe in months, but not more, I will have to make a recommendation to my government. And if we don't find the sort of comprehensive solution that we need, then we will probably enter direct negotiations with the US government to find a bilateral agreement on access to users' data. Second, I have been tasked with easing the fight against the use of internet for terrorist purposes, meaning we need to find a way to detect, take down, and make sure terrorist contents actually stay down. The cooperation is better. We're not there yet, and we need to make progress very quickly, because it will be, in 3 months, it will be a year after the G7 and the European Council has issued conclusions on that. If 1 year after that we haven't made the kind of progress we need, then yes, I guess my government will be more than convinced that new legislation will be necessary, be it at the European level or the national level. And having said that, again, I guess it is in the reach of Internet and jurisdiction to propose something that could allow or that could enable a better cooperation between the companies, the governments. We would all like to see a system in which civil society could have an eye on the kind of contents that we need to detect and take down. At the same time, we need this process to be very quick, and that's what we're asking the platforms, because we know that after an hour a content has been posted, the dissemination has been done. So it's too late to do anything. Yeah, I know my time is over, so I'm going to stop now. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the comment. I of course hear with great interest the call, and I appreciate it. Making a distinction that I think is important at that stage between the policy network and the Secretariat itself, and there is a need for an articulation between the two. I think your comment is shared by a certain number of other participants that have shared it privately with us as the Secretariat. I think the Ottawa meeting is an opportunity for precisely testing the common will of the network members regarding their desire to go in that direction and to potentially ask the Secretariat to go in this direction and be even more proactive in proposing on the basis of the discussions that have taken place and the various consultations frameworks, to use Cathy Brown's approach, or components of framework. What I just want to say is the effort that we've done with the policy options document and the work plan is precisely to propose what you're going to discuss tomorrow, and I will explain in more detail after the end of this session, a series of components that is in a certain way or composes the skeleton of any kind of agreement that might take place. Whether it is a skeleton that will be used by the different actors to develop their own things so that it is compatible and interoperable, or whether it is the embryo of a specific regime that the different actors might adhere to, is almost something that can come as we discuss it. And the goal of this Ottawa Conference is precisely to have an agreement on what are the components of the solutions. And if there is a strong message that comes out of this conference that people are ready to actually move faster and explore concrete proposals, the Secretariat, as we've said before and we will repeat it, is here to serve. And fundamentally, this is also an objective of this conference, to understand exactly where is the common will and how much are you expecting the Secretariat to provide. But thank you for doing this, and we welcome, of course, other comments in that regard to sense what is the message of the network in general.
Thank you very much. Our next discussant in the line is Chris Wilson. He's the Senior Manager of Public Policy at Amazon. And if he gets a microphone, please. Thank you very much. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. I represent a small upstart company based in Seattle, Washington. We're hoping to make it big one day on the internet. I joke, but it's really a pleasure to be here. This is Amazon's first true engagement with the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. It's not for lack of interest. The company's clearly interested in all of the work that this policy network is doing. As a company with a variety of different business models, not the least of which, of course, is cloud computing. But we also have a content creation business. We have a domain name business, among many others. So clearly, all the policy work that's going on here is of importance to us. So it's a real pleasure to be here and to be engaged with so many smart and forward-looking individuals in the room. I think, Paul, one of your tee-up questions was what should we keep in mind when we have these discussions? And I turn to there's a variety of leadership principles that all employees of Amazon need to keep in mind, or asked to keep in mind when they iterate on technology products, when they work, in my case, work on public policy issues. And one of those key leadership principles is customer obsession. Always keeping the customer in mind when you make decisions. We all have our own unique customer base. It may be the citizenry, it may be law enforcement, it may be, in our case, obviously, a variety of customers in our business units. But I think it's important, sometimes we lose track of those customers. I know even in my day-to-day work on public policy issues, I always sometimes lose track of that. And I think it's important that we all keep those customers in mind as we do this work, because ultimately, the work we do impacts lives, hopefully for the better, hopefully for the positive. And that's a tough task, hard task, but I think it's important to note that. I'd also say, of course, and another important reason why Amazon has decided to fully engage and participate is that we are really, I think, at an inflection point for the future, if you will, the efficacy of multi-stakeholder internet public policy making. Obviously, there have been some real successes in this regard. I think obviously the ICANN-IANA transition was one of them, and I think we're hoping to have more wins and more successes this year and in years beyond. And I think it's important, certainly as certain multilateral organizations attempt to, I think, broaden their scope in internet public policy making. It's important that we have those multi-stakeholder wins to perhaps fend off some of those other initiatives. So a real pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, and I look forward to working with you all in the coming days.
Thank you very much, Chris. Our next discussant in line is Katherine MAHER. Katherine MAHER is the Executive Director of the Wikimedia Foundation. Katherine, you have the floor.
Thank you. We at the Wikimedia Foundation build a product that probably many of you here in this room use. And as an institution that builds product, we know that it can be tempting to isolate for the most dominant use cases when you're trying to solve complex problems. But despite the increased complexity it requires, we are here to make an appeal to a truly inclusive approach and making progress towards coherent policy solutions that truly meets the needs of all stakeholders. We believe firmly that we cannot risk, in the name of national sovereignty, the increases in value that the internet has brought us in increased productivity, educational opportunity, and the representation of historically marginalized and excluded voices. Moreover, as the much discussed next billion come online, we also want to recognize that we cannot deny these new digital citizens the opportunities to benefit from and participate in the further development and governance of the shared global good. So as a representative of Wikimedia, a transnational free knowledge, non-commercial project that exists in the public good and governed with a commitment to public interest, I am very worried about the prospect of an internet that has walls along national borders in which certain content is available in one place and not another. But more specifically, as the Executive Director of the Wikimedia Foundation, which hosts Wikipedia and has legal contact for the project, I also know that we must develop those pathways that are generally inclusive of multiple stakeholders and enable smaller and non-commercial efforts, such as ourselves, to flourish. The Wikimedia Foundation, which supports our volunteer contributors from every corner of the globe, from Indonesia to Argentina, in 300 languages, has fewer than 300 staff. So unlike my colleague Chris, we are truly a small global organization with tremendous international reach. We're the 5th most popular digital property on the planet, visited by more than 1 billion unique devices each and every month. We are a values-driven organization, and yet we are also pragmatic. Our resources are a fraction of our reach and our positive public impact. Organizations such as ours, operating with different interests, charters, and resources, require a seat at the table when decisions about international cooperation are made regarding content, data, or domains. Specifically, we cared very passionately about clear, transparent content policies governing copyright to illegal content. And at the same time, our models and resources for addressing these challenges are foundationally different. Yet they may offer an example of that coherent yet distributed framework for which we have all been discussing today. We allow for flexibility in the way that information is governed at the project level by individual languages, by individual communities, and yet there is a clarity and consistency across each of those 300 languages in what we consider acceptable on Wikipedia. Policymakers, including those in the room, should be concerned about the impact that these cross-border agreements and processes have on the public commons. Sustainable solutions cannot be tailored only to the needs, capacities, business and regulatory models, and jurisdictional advantages of the largest actors, but must leave room for alternative stakeholders as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katherine. With this, we are resuming our speaking queue. And there were 4 speakers that were actually lined up in the previous segment. If they have changed, we would check this very quickly. The first one that I have in the queue was a lady over there in the back. Would you still like to take the floor? Could we have a microphone, please?
Thank you. My name is Hansor Park. I work at the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate under the UN Security Council. Thank you very much for your invitation. This is a very important discussion, and we're also excited to be here. I just want to add one aspect following the comment from the Department of Justice in Germany and also the statement from Cloudflare. we have been working on especially the terrorist online content, how to take them down and then make sure that they are not uploaded again. And also to make sure that those, not only we take down those content, but use those content to preserve and also use them as electronic evidence to the court proceedings to make sure that those terrorists are brought to justice. And during this work stream, one of the main challenges that we've observed is that the capacity of the startup companies. And we would like to highlight that there's immense challenges and vulnerability faced by startup tech sector, and not only for terrorist online content, but also for just following up with the discussions that we have in this room. And one example that we also provide is the example of Just Pace It. It's a startup company that was basically exploited heavily by a terrorist group for file sharing, and it's a file sharing website run by one person, and he has been struggling so much to find those content and how to respond to all these things. At the same time, try to keep up with the global norms and framework discussions. And I look forward to having further insights from all of you in this room, and just want to highlight the capacity and vulnerabilities of the threats faced by the startup companies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next one in the queue was over there. If we could please have a microphone for Greg.
Hi, I'm Greg Nogine with the Center for Democracy and Technology. We're a civil society group based in Washington. We have an office in Brussels. We don't have 300 employees. We only have 30. So I guess we're a startup, but we've been starting up for about a quarter century now. I'm concerned about a dynamic that I fear can arise in these discussions, and that is countries saying that they will resort to extraterritorial demands if they don't have a solution in the near future, in the immediate future. Extraterritoriality, with respect to content takedowns, with respect to data demands, I think is something that we should be explicitly against as a group, and that we should come out and say in our papers, this is a global bad. And the reason I'm worried about it in particular is because it tends to feed this, what I call a race to the bottom. This idea that we have to make accommodations to all these countries that have different systems, that might have weaker protection of rights than other countries might have. We have to make those accommodations in order to avoid extraterritoriality. And I'm very worried that we're going to have, instead of a system that is designed to protect rights, that's based on principles that the countries have agreed to in other contexts, that we end up with a race to the bottom, and that we leave behind rights like the ability of a user to have notice, the ability of a user to have an appeal process when their data is taken down, the ability of a user to be confident that their data won't go into the hands of a law enforcement agency in any country, anywhere in the world, unless there's been an independent decision, a decision by an independent judge that there is strong evidence that they are involved in crime. I'm worried about that because I can see us moving in that direction unless we are very careful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a follow-up? Okay, so, well, does follow-up work if you're not
Just, right, so 1 minute. Peter Swire from Georgia Tech, and I'll be moderating the data event and track tomorrow. I think, Greg, I have agreement in many ways about the perils of extraterritoriality. Many terrible things can happen down that path, and Bertrand listed it as one of the 3 themes to keep in mind for the day. I think that there's a normative question, is it good or not? There's also a descriptive question, is it likely to happen? And so while having the normative debates, you might want to predict how effective justice ministries, interior ministries are going to be at getting the stuff they want. You might think it's terrible, But in many countries, in many settings, as a sort of description of the world, the justice ministries are able to get things. So we can't simply wave it away because we wish it weren't there. I think we also need to think through the descriptive side. And if we have an accurate prediction of bad things, we need to be ready for that.
Many people here have talked about governments in general. You've just talked about countries. I'm very uncomfortable with that. I represent the French government. I don't represent governments. So I don't think the French democracy has the kind of process that you can see in North Korea or other countries. So if you have problems with countries with an extraterritorial intent, could you please name them?
May I take a 1 minute contribution? That's good. That's starting to eat up. Okay, Sunil, you get a 1 minute. Let's have a quick exchange so that the tension grows a little, because you've been too quiet. I mean, come on. Sunil Abraham from, yes, go ahead, should work.
Yeah, I'd like to name some countries. Yeah. Especially those countries that are dependent on a vibrant copyright regime. In those countries, the governments don't consider copyright enforcement as a type of censorship. In India, under our copyright law, I can photocopy a full textbook because I have a research need or I'm a student. So my user rights as an Indian citizen is not respected because most global platforms only follow the rules of powerful governments where they are based. Thank you.
Yes, here. And I will make one intervention at 1 minute. Yes, go
1
ahead.
minute as well. John Curran, President and CEO, Aaron. I just want to say I respect the comment that was made earlier about rights. And I think we need to take that very seriously. We need to remember that everything we do is going to affect the rights of people on the internet. And these rights are in balance with each other. But I also want us to say that there are rights of other parties. So your right about anonymity or privacy intersects someone else's right to have their due process or their right to have recourse in a court of law. So it's not either or. These rights are rights that have to be considered in total, and no one gets absolute rights one way or the other in anything we do.
And Mokhtar, you wanted to have a 1 minute as well? Please.
No, I just want to make sure that what has been said by Kati before she leaves is actually well taken into consideration. From the African Union point of view, or from the African countries' point of view, we wouldn't like to fall into a situation where we have to scare people about using ICTs or using internet and so on. And therefore, we are more inclined to guidelines, to framework than something that more rigid. Because you certainly know that most of the shutdowns are mainly coming from that kind of region or close to that. And therefore, we don't want to push them to the extreme at this point of time of evolution. So that's what I wanted to emphasize on. Thank you.
Thank you. I will take a 1 minute to do two things. One, picking back on what Maria was saying before, it was a misunderstanding. It's not that they're always competing or conflicting. They're sometimes competing, and what was just mentioned is an illustration that there are elements of overlap, and sometimes the different objectives are complementary. And what is at stake is precisely to go in the direction that you mentioned, to see as much as possible when the different principles can be combined. That's exactly what I meant, so maybe I misexpressed myself. I just want to highlight the question of extraterritoriality. The brief discussion that we had is exactly the reason why I was putting this word in the, throwing it, it's almost that I have a baton with the word extraterritoriality and I throw it in the middle because this is a very important issue. And as part of the explanation and the illustration of the methodology that we want to follow, what I hear behind this is that there is a need to make categories of situations of extraterritoriality so that we know exactly what we're talking about. When a few years ago, there was a decision regarding a domain name operator and a registrar, where the law of one country was actually applied through this registrar to a registrant that was in a completely different region. That's extraterritoriality, when the national legislation over a platform in one country is actually imposed and has an impact on users of this platform that are in another country. That's an element of extraterritoriality. But vice versa, when there are principles in development that say, the moment you provide a service to my territory, you need to respect my laws in a small or large degree. That's another type of extraterritoriality. And we need to be very conscious and very coherent and very clear about the types of extraterritorial extension of sovereignty that we're talking about in order to be able to determine if and when they are appropriate, excessive, or inappropriate. Because the question is not only whether it's a total bad or total good, it's also about nuance. And I know that in the debates that we are following, nuance is very difficult to sell. But this is what it is about. There are situations where it is appropriate when there are sufficient due process mechanisms to have extraterritoriality, and there are situations where they are disproportionate because not enough impact assessment has been done regarding the voluntary or involuntary impact out of the borders. And I have a very simple expression, which is basically excess of sovereignty might be against sovereignty itself. If you are exercising extraterritoriality and you don't think that one day the same treatment is going to be applied to you, you're delusional. So Immanuel Kant is striking again. Yes, one, and we should resume the queue because we will have time to talk about this a bit tomorrow.
Just a question on this. When I hear David talking about the situation in France, we know about America versus Ireland, etc. As far as I know, for instance, there is a representative from the European Commission, as far as I know, somewhere. Don't we talk rearguard? Don't we have here a rearguard action, actually? Because there is something on the way from Brussels, as far as I know. There are efforts to sort things out. And although I feel with the gentleman who is putting extraterritoriality per se at issue, I would say this is, you know, I have been, you know, I'm actually perverted by politics, but be quick and be clear about it, and again join forces with those who are already on track on these issues. That would be my part to the story. And actually, if you allow me 10 seconds. That is actually what I was talking about in the first round when I was talking about connecting. The documents are wonderful, but they need connection with the political, with the political forces, with the political powers that be. And you have it in your hands, and don't wait, you know, on that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this echoes how much tomorrow counts and no pressure. On you. On you. I think with this, we have currently 4 people in the speakers queue. Yes, I know you are among them. What I propose is that we go back to our 2 remaining listed discussants. I would like to give the floor now to Jan KLEIJSSEN, the Director of Information Society and Action Against Crime of the Council of Europe. And I would like to mention as well that the Council of Europe is one of the institutional supporters of this conference. Jan, you have the floor.
It's coming. Yes, it works. Thank you very much. Perhaps I will answer not only the why that Bertrand put, but also the what and the how, in order to meet your three-question approach. Not sure whether that comes from Kant as well, but in any case, it's probably appropriate. Why are we an institutional supporter? The Council of Europe is a 47 member state organization based in Strasbourg, which deals with human rights, rule of law and democracy. And one of our main angles is freedom of expression, access to information online and offline, as well as respect for the rule of law online and offline. And these values are very much under attack. This morning I received the news that after a murder of a prominent journalist in Malta a few months ago, a young Slovak journalist, also called Jan Kuciak, was murdered together with his girlfriend because of the investigations he carried out into of corruption and money laundering. And it is perhaps at this discussion at a sometimes high level of abstraction useful to recall that the internet can only be free and safe if its users are. And that when we speak about human rights, we speak about humans. What do? We try to, our approach is to try and find common legal standards, binding where possible, based on existing best practice, to deal with the issues, very much the same issues that this conference deals with. We have a few instruments that you may have heard of, the Data Protection Convention 108, which binds well over 50 countries worldwide. In fact, it binds almost half of those countries that have data protection legislation. And we have a Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, where last year we were active in over 130 countries worldwide on capacity building. We also deal with the prevention of terrorism, organized crime, and a number of other issues. And tomorrow, during the work streams, I'll come back to those. We also have a study on fake news that recently was published, which tries to differentiate between the various forms of fake news, and that might be useful for the debate as well. What we'd like to deal with in the future, and it was mentioned only once, I think, so far, but it is an argument as to why we should hurry. And perhaps I know the argument was made, one shouldn't hurry too much, and we should take our time. But for me, and also for my organization, it is the question of artificial intelligence. A number of years ago, the sheep Dolly appeared. And within 1 or 2 years, the Council of Europe had established an internationally binding treaty to ban human cloning. In retrospect, I think that was probably a wise decision. The Economist recently argued that as regards artificial intelligence, we could take our time, soft touch on regulation, and we fix it when it goes wrong. I would beg to differ. I think it is probably wise to look at it already now. That is to the what. As to the how, we try to bring together government, civil society, and since November, the private sector. Several of you here signed an official agreement with the Council of Europe, and I now have a seat at the table. And that seat is, there are still vacant seats at the table for those of you who would be interested to join this intergovernmental process, to which civil society has already been a part. But one of our big challenges is indeed the question that Bertrand put on policy coherence. Recently, ICANN asked the Council of Europe a contribution on its public consultation on the WHOIS database, and I was not able to reply with one contribution. I had to give two, because the different stakeholders within government, in our case data protection commissioners and the cybercrime fighters, could not agree on a single approach. So we gave two sets of recommendations to ICANN, and let me say, being the eternal optimist, that they were complementary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. Now I would like to give the floor to BYRON Holland. He's the president and CEO of the Canadian Internet Registry Authority, CIRA, and a member of the advisory group of this conference. BYRON, you have the floor.
Thank you, Paul. And first, let me just say I have to apologize to this group. I know that you've come to Canada in February, and we had promised winter. You packed your parkas, you packed your boots, you packed your gloves, you packed your toques. and we have failed to deliver. On the other hand, I hope you enjoy a nice walk in the beautiful spring sunshine. But whether it's the winter chill of Canada or the summer days of Australia and everywhere in between, the internet connects us. It binds us, and most definitely it sometimes separates us. It's borderless, which gives it its depth, but it also opens us up to differing perspectives on risks around security, rights, privacy, and certainly content, data, and domains. You know, as I've listened to the conversation thus far, a few things have really struck me. And one is already in the room, the differing perspectives that we hear, which I think is healthy and good for this discussion. Just listening to some of the governments that have spoken thus far, talk about their competing demands and perspectives, not the least of which was Minister Baines, who spoke so forcefully about Canada's support of net neutrality, when we know that not all governments necessarily support it to that level. We talked about urgency, or we've heard about urgency, but not having knee-jerk reactions for solutions. But what really resonated to me was Kathy's discussion around frameworks, and how frameworks can get us to a path of norms, and norms can lead us to the next step. And what struck me is maybe it's frameworks. Policy coherence is extremely important, but maybe first we need framework coherence. A framework coherence is an intermediary step. And that really resonated with me as well. But my organization, CIRA, operates its own network, and we have equipment and data and physical presence around the world. And the issues that we are discussing right now, that we've already discussed, we'll discuss this week, have a direct impact on my organization and all operators in this room and beyond, be they TLD operators or ISPs or everybody else in the supply chain that John Curran, I thought, very articulately spoke of. And as this room knows, these are complex, often esoteric, transnational issues of which we discuss. But of course, they're also very real, very on the ground, very operational issues. And Canada is not unique. We perhaps, like everybody in this room, have our own flavor of these issues. But I thought hosting this event in Canada is remarkably timely. Some of the issues we're going to cover over the next 3 days are currently active discussions here. And I mean, as we speak right now, they're in discussion. A prime example of this is a submission from the incumbent telcos and some of their peers to Canada's telecommunications regulator, requesting that websites containing pirated material, at least according to them, be identified and the Canadian ISPs be required to block them based on an independent notifier rather than traditional legal due process. So I mean, that issue is hot. Submissions are being taken till March 6th, that's only next week. So it's a very real issue for us. Another involves the right to be forgotten. Our highest court has ordered Google to remove certain results from worldwide search results. Again, speaking directly to the notion of transnational issues. In closing, knowing that my time is beyond, well past, I think the examples I've shared are Canadian, but certainly not unique to Canada. And there will be many perspectives in this room. But I think that we can all agree on the urgency to find solutions, or at the very least, frameworks. So coordinated by the I&J project, we laid the foundation last year in Paris, and I think, and worked hard at that. And we must work hard in the next 2 days so that we can go to the final conference in Berlin and begin to make recommendations and take action. So I hope we're all prepared over the next 3 days to share our expertise, to roll up our sleeves, and help shape the future of the internet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next one in the queue is Catherine. Maybe Bertrand. Yes.
Thank you very much, Bertrand. I think the time on the screen is a good illustration of the limitations of policy. So I'm also persuaded by Kathy Brown's comments on frameworks, and perhaps just to refer to institutional frameworks. The internet is not static. I believe it's going to undergo some tremendous changes in the years to come. It's going to change from being an internet of persons to an internet of things, including intelligent things. And therefore, I wonder if the policies that we make today will be adequate to go into the future. Now, there are other areas in the world where we deal with things which are transnational, including money. And most countries, at least, or I think all countries, have a central bank that is the institution that controls the flow of money and protects its national value. What kind of institutions should we have around data to not just have a static policy, but also to make day-to-day decisions in line with the changes that are taking place in this environment? We also have exchanges in the financial world. And I'm thinking that many of the issues we have here concern complex exchanges, exchanging data for functionality or access to services, exchanging privacy for increased security, exchanging property rights for social good, if I follow the argument of my Indian colleague. Can these exchanges just take place in a world where we make a single static policy, or do we need institutions that define and continue to protect and continue to build good decisions? I think I've kept to the policy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The next one in the queue was over there. Could we please have a microphone for Rod?
Testing, there we go. Rod Rasmussen, here in my personal capacity, since I've largely retired from building a company that in cybersecurity that is responsible probably for millions of takedowns over the course of its history. So we've had to deal with a lot of these issues in various forms, mostly around abuse. Wanted to really riff on the same themes I'm hearing here, but from a slightly different direction to add more emphasis to the concepts around frameworks and this sense of urgency that we have. These all tie together. But I wanted to come at it from the perspective of the nature of the abuse itself and what is being abused when it comes to talking about abuse on the internet. A short anecdote to make my point. I attended the ICANN meeting in Vancouver. It was actually my first ICANN meeting, which was back in 2005. I was representing the anti-phishing working group, which I still do to this day. When I got to the border and said I was with the anti-phishing working group of Canada, getting in was a little bit of a challenge because, and then I explained, well, it's PH phishing. What's that, right? It's a band, right? Yeah, there we go. So what I wanted to emphasize here is a couple of things, is that we have a very rapidly changing threat landscape where abuse changes over time. So phishing today, most people in this room know what it is, and we've actually kind of agreed that that's a really bad thing that we should work towards together to eliminate from the internet. The nature of abuse changes constantly, though, and the resources that are being abused are constantly changing. So frameworks are essential to being able to do this going forward. I also note that phishing, we understand now, what is the next Bitcoin mining and Bitcoin mining bots. So a lot of us in the room know what that is, but that's one of the current things. These things change. Taxonomy is also an issue. So as we go forward on this work that we're doing, a couple of results I would like to see are frameworks that look at categories of things. Does this abuse affect the network? Does this abuse affect trust in the network? Things like that as the category builders. And then also taxonomies. We have various places that are collecting taxonomies, but we need to be able to translate a taxonomy of what one area says is this kind of abuse with national laws and other policy things that people are implementing either in a corporate policy or a platform policy or a national policy. Thanks.
Thank you very much. The next one in the queue is over there.
Thank you. Malcolm Hutton, London Internet Exchange. I'd like to take up Ambassador Martinon's challenge. He challenged us to name countries, and everyone's ducked it. Certain countries, France among them, have established for themselves over the course of many years a good reputation as rights-protective countries, ones that can be trusted. But they've done so not through the legendary power of the charm of French diplomacy, but because they can point over a long period to a good record of restraining straight action, constraining straight action, legitimate state action against suspected wrongdoing by principles and norms, rules of law, independent judiciary, the principle that there should be consistency in the application of those rules and that one person is to be treated like another, and a whole range of other principles. And the countries that we consider to be the trustworthy ones are the ones that can point to that record. Now, how does that apply in this new environment? Here, that record was established when directing state power at the suspected bad actor. But we are talking about, for the most part, directing that power at some intermediary, and often not through compulsory mechanisms, but by voluntary processes, and often not in utilizing any of those mechanisms by which that reputation was established. So I think we come to a fork in the road. We need to look to see, do we wish to take the same principles and the same kinds of processes and tweak them and adjust them for this new environment so that they can be applied as best as possible within this environment, recognizing that if we do so, we will not be able to fully satisfy all the demands or fully deal with all the abuse that happens? Or do we dispense with those principles and the trust that that has built, and instead say that we act on a voluntary basis, a basis that is more arbitrary, a basis that does not have clearly established predictable law or the principles of consistency and so forth, that gives us more flexibility and scalability to achieve a higher level of of enforcement, but without that rights protective mechanism. This is the fork in the road that I think we have, and the countries that are judged trustworthy will be judged trustworthy in the new age by how they live up to that challenge.
Thank you very much. The next one in the queue is Joe. Could we please have a microphone?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I'd just like to add a word about the importance of healthy tensions, right? And I'd like to build up a bit on what Jan KLEIJSSEN said and refer to something that Peter Swire said. Firstly, we should perhaps remember how important it is to have the tensions between the two groups that Jan said, right? In other words, the privacy and data protection people on the one hand and the cybercrime advocates on the other hand. These healthy tensions are very important. And if we just learn a lesson from history, one or two lessons, I'll point out why. There are many sayings, festina lente, in Latin being one of them, but more haste, less speed. So I get worried when I hear governments say, we want to go very fast, very urgent. Is it because they're really going to achieve something, or is it because they want to be seen to be doing something, which seems to be a political imperative? And Jan, you know, I'm an open and vocal advocate and supporter of the Council of Europe's Data Protection Convention and Cybercrime Convention. But let me remind you of one problem that we still have in the Cybercrime Convention is because we're in a hurry, because we wanted to get it done, we didn't solve the problem of jurisdiction, and we didn't solve the problem of putting in proper human rights protection into that convention. And that's something I want to avoid next time round. Going to what Peter was saying, what happens when ministries of justice start speaking about something, especially if you're a negotiator for a government, you know, and nobody knows this better than for example, we have members from the European Commission here, but anybody who's involved in Brussels will know that you have your ministries of justice and your ministries of the interior and your ministries of economic affairs all telling you things that you should be saying during your negotiations, and they're not the same things. And you have to somehow solve those things, and it takes time to resolve those tensions. Which is why, when we look at what's going to happen next, we have to look at, for example, those singular examples, like the Dutch example from the 4th of January of 2016, when the Ministry of the Interior and the Ministry of Justice spoke with one voice in one document, where they actually said, for the time being, guys, we think it's a bad idea to have backdoor to encryptions and other ways, which is a clear example of one country giving a lead and hopefully many other countries following. Now, we need to coalesce around that position, the Dutch leadership, and other positions of leadership. France, for example, has, and I've said this openly, shown a lead in the way to take pragmatic approaches to oversight of foreign surveillance. We need to have those kind of approaches too, but let's not hurry too much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next in line is Henriette. Could we please have a microphone over there? No, Henriette, please. You're also on the line, don't worry.
Thank you, Paul. Just a few reactions. Firstly, to Mokhtar from the African Union Commission. Mokhtar, speaking as an African with experience of many African governments, who I won't name because it might take too long, the problem is not the fundamental lack of trust of the internet. It's the fear of the internet. It's the fear of being held accountable. It's the fear of transparency. It's the fear of losing power. And no matter how cautious or diplomatic we are with regard to the internet in such context, it's not going to deal with the fundamental problem, which is that we need to establish accountability, democracy, good governance, and the internet is seen as a threat, and I don't think I think that's good. I think we actually need to emphasize the subversive nature of the internet in authoritarian, non-accountable, non-democratic context. And then just some thoughts about the cloud. And you know, when we talk about territoriality and jurisdiction, it's not clear to me always whether we're looking at the cloud as a common space, as the sea or the air, or we're actually looking at it as a space that is difficult to negotiate at the moment, a little bit like mining and land rights were in the 19th century, because there are people who have vested interests that want to make profit, and it's difficult to do so in this unpredictable environment. And I think Sunil's point is a very, very good one. Do we on the cloud follow the Indian model, where users have this right to copy textbook, which in fact then will violate copyright regimes in many of the countries where the companies that dominate the cloud are based. So it's really quite challenging. And I think one thing that this project could do is perhaps look at how we approach the cloud. Do we approach it as if it's really an extraterritorial space, how do we put the public interest forward? How do we define the public interest? Who are the citizens, and how do we define their rights? And that might be quite a useful way of approaching it, rather than just looking at the challenge of multiple jurisdiction and cross extraterritoriality.
Thank you very much. Next in line is the OSCE over there. Could we please have a microphone?
Thanks. Hi, I'm Frane Marojevic from the OSCE Freedom of the Media. Here we are discussing quite a lot about national laws, about extraterritoriality, and a framework was mentioned, and I would just like to remind that we do have a very good framework when it comes to human rights, which is the International Covenant of Civil Political Rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights when it comes to content, and I don't think it should these principles should be changed just because we are talking about content that is online. The problematic content was happening many years ago, and it was problematic then as it is now. The difference is, of course, the way and the speed that this content can be distributed, and this is the challenge that we are addressing now. So we have to come back to our fundamental human rights principles. But the problem that when we discuss national laws and extraterritoriality, we're not discussing actually the terms of service, which are actually governing most of these issues online. And what we are seeing now is that in many cases, authorities and governments are making references to the terms of service of the service providers, of the intermediaries, of the platforms, when they are requesting for content takedown. So there is no legal process or procedure that needs to be established in this case, because you're just telling an intermediary, this content breaks your own terms of service, so please take it down. And the blurring comes very much when such requests come from the authorities direct. So they have some kind of an by implication, a legal position, reference to laws, but they don't have any kind of a judicial process in it. And another element is, in this kind of discussion and context of the terms of service and the role of intermediaries, is establishment of so-called self-regulatory mechanisms for such internet intermediaries. And I think we should be also very careful when we discuss self-regulatory mechanism, because when we come to traditional media, self-regulation does not mean I choose to regulate myself and I choose how to regulate myself. Self-regulation means that the industry sets up certain rules and the industry regulates itself. But this is not the same thing as we are talking about in many examples of this such self-regulation. So I think a word of caution there.
Thank you very much. Next one in line is the gentleman over there. Yes, you have the floor.
Thank you. My name is Mario Castillo. I work for the ECLAC, Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and we support to the Latin American country in terms of its public policy. And one of the main initiatives, we act as a technical secretary for the digital strategy in Latin America. And this content, I would like to express in a few words what is our experience, and I think that Latin America is a good example of the region of the middle-income countries. And there are two main aspects that I think is very important in terms to develop a new framework for regulation. One of them is related with how the best way to link digital economy with the new economic and social strategy. I think that there are many challenges that it's important to face in terms of infrastructure and another topic related with very critical condition. And the second area is related with the idea is Latin America could be a space, a digital space for a new digital market. Latin America has a long tradition in terms of the cooperation, in terms to try to develop a common market. But in terms of the digital market, there is a lot of expectative for the Latin American country. And again, the regulation is critical in terms of the e-commerce, data protection, and other topics. I think that is important in the case of Latin America because it's a representative. The many countries worldwide that face the main challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next one in the queue is Jordan over there. If we could please get one microphone, just for information for the other stakeholders in the room. The queue is empty after that, so please raise your hand if you want to take the floor.
Thanks, Paul. My name is Jordan Carter. I'm from Internet New Zealand, which is the .nz CCTLD registry, among other things. I just want to make a first point. The question early on was, why are we all here? I'm here because if you have a so-called multi-stakeholder forum without some of the people being affected by the discussion not here, you end up having a discussion that could get lost, and that's not in anyone's interests. So I think CCs are an important part of the internet infrastructure story and the topics that are on the agenda. We need to be here participating, hearing the perspectives and sharing our own. I just wanted to mention two of those briefly. One of them probably doesn't need a lot of discussion in this room. There used to be a view in the technology community or the internet technical community that we could just ignore what governments or the public wanted because we knew what we were doing and it would all be just fine, so don't worry about it. I suspect that not many people hold that view today, but the point to make is that if we don't listen to the social pressures that are coming from the interaction of our infrastructure with a huge community now, it's no longer a small section of the community that's using the internet, governments will push us anyway. So we have a right and a responsibility, I think, to be involved with and leading those discussions. The second tension I just wanted to highlight is the difference between internet speed and judicial speed. 10 years ago, people were talking about how terrible it would be if there was an intergovernmental agreement on internet policy because, diplomats move so slowly and so on. But now often we find an example of domain name takedowns. Authorities want things done in minutes or hours. But what we tend to say is go back to your own due process to justify it. So that's why an organization like mine is very supportive of the work this project is doing to build some frameworks. I think the insight there is that we can flexibly apply these to local circumstances and local law. And I guess the point I'd make is that we can proclaim ourselves in the community as being able to get things done quickly. We have to show the urgency that Steve Del Bianco referred to earlier on today. Because if we are seen as dragging our heels or slowing down pragmatic adjustments, once again, the temptation will be to go around and through the technical community and to push things into intergovernmental or quick responses that just won't deliver not only for us who operate the infrastructure, but for any of the people who use it or the governments who think they're trying to make things better. So in supporting that work is another reason why we're here. Thanks for the chance to make an intervention.
Yes, can we have a microphone over there, please?
Thank you. My name is Hansor Park again, speaking from UNCTAD, Counterterrorism Directorate under the UN Security Council. We had very valuable insights about the human rights and how it should be respected throughout the way. And in fact, our human rights officer will be very happy to be here, I believe. I just want to share that what we believe is that in the end, we have to satisfy in the end both security, like safe internet environment at the same time also human rights. And our office also, as a UN agency, we are also trying to promote the UN human rights standard. And there are efforts that we observe that we are in a process of collecting best practices and also promote knowledge sharing. For example, when they search digital evidence, they try to get the judicial court order just like the official, the offline evidence, and make sure that they have judicial order before getting into securing digital evidence. And at the same time, it's true that some investigators, they need evidence to go forward. And in that case, just going through the mutual legal assistance, which is completely traditional and formal way, which has multiple layers of judicial safeguard, but at the same time, the speed of MLA does not satisfy at times for emergency cases. In that case, sometimes they first request for preservation of the data and then go through the formal process to make sure that the data is not lost on the way. And also for content takedown, freedom of expression, sometimes they remove the access to the data without completely deleting it, but at the same time going through the AI scanning, and also after that human eye scanning, sometimes when they realize that this is human rights activist content, that they sometimes put it back. And probably we will continue facing a lot of gray areas that we have to have a lot of discussions to find a way to categorize. And I fully agree with Bertrand, who also spoke about categorizing the right actions that we're talking about. And I believe in the end, we will have to satisfy both security, a safe environment, and also human rights. And this is not an option for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next one behind me, could we please have a microphone for the gentleman?
It's coming? Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to make a contribution to this great discussion. I think the discussion here on the floor already shows that there is a big need for such a conference. I'm with the Department of Justice of the Netherlands, Justice and Security, and I would like to stress that there is due process needed, and the government intervention should always be proportionate, but proportionate to the threat. And the threat is great when it comes to online abuse. And while online abuse can be addressed by its users, governments have the monopoly to enforce justice, to actually hold the criminals accountable. And therefore access to data is crucial. So I would very much look forward to the discussion tomorrow on the workforce of data, and look forward to input from all stakeholders, because I also do underline the necessity for a framework, and not go for the lowest denominator, but also not the lowest denominator when it comes to security. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could we have a microphone here, please, for Michael? And after, I have 2 additional interventions, and after that we're intending to close, at least for now, the queue.
My name is Michael Rotet. I'm representing the small and medium internet service providers in Germany and in Europe. From an association point of view, I'm following this discussion with interest, and when I read the workbook, it sounded very good, and the idea from Kathy about the framework was really good, but some of the voices I heard today looked for me as if it's very easy to always point out the service providers when there is any need of information, of data, or of doing things. So we have the old discussion that the internet service providers are still the deputies of governments, and this is, I think, a bad idea. When the discussion came out about a fast solution, I think the fastest solution could be streamlining the MLA mechanism, mutual legal assistance, the discussion between the governments and the exchange between the governments. That would solve a lot of problems between authorities and extraterritorial internet service providers in other countries. And streamlining the MLA mechanism is much easier than dealing with hundreds of thousands of small service providers with 2 or 3 employees only, speaking bad English or no English at all. And having heard what Jan KLEIJSSEN said with the Budapest Convention, already 130 countries are in the line of the Budapest Convention. That could be a starting point for MLA discussion for first solution, instead of having the service providers as deputies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next in the line is over there. Michael, could we please have a microphone over there? And there are 4 last interventions for this section, and we have closed the queue.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'll stand up. My name is Michael Geist. I'm a law professor at the University of Ottawa, and I appreciate the chance to contribute. It's been a fascinating dialogue as we shift from civil society to platforms and providers to governments. But it was striking to me, as BYRON Holland talked a bit about the situation in Canada, how a number of groups or parties that really make significant determinations in this area aren't the kinds of people that are necessarily part of this discussion right now. So in Canada, we've actually had 3 extraterritorial-like issues. There's the site blocking issue that BYRON mentioned with, if you're interested, the ability to submit in through March. There's also the Equistack case at the Supreme Court of Canada that was decided that gave Canadian courts the clear power to issue orders with impact outside the jurisdiction. And just a couple of weeks ago, we had our Privacy Commissioner of Canada issue a report on the so-called right to be forgotten, or the right to de-index, which also tried to grapple with the extraterritorial issue. What's striking to me really from there is 2 points. One, as I say, those groups aren't necessarily, I know some people are here in the room, but how we take frameworks, or the desire to develop these frameworks, and bring them into that environment strikes me as an enormous challenge. To take the Equistack case as an example, we ought to be somewhat humble here. Many groups in there, I know there are people in the room that intervened in that case. The Supreme Court of Canada was not interested in a framework. It was not interested, quite frankly, even by and large in hearing from many of the groups that expressed and tried to make sure they were aware of the implications of issuing this kind of order. They had litigants before them, and they said in this case they're entitled to issue the kind of order that they ultimately did, and the implications would be left for a different court or a different government or a different provider to have to grapple with down the road. And so I raise this only to point out that the mechanisms that we identify, not just within the framework, but how we bridge that into regulatory agencies that aren't necessarily government, that operate independently, to the judiciary and to others who aren't necessarily participants here, strike me as absolutely essential if the kinds of frameworks that we're working on here are to have, at the end of the day, the kind of impact that we're hoping for.
Thank you very much. Next in line is Harlem Desir. Could we please have a microphone over there? There? No. There. Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. So I'm Harlem Desir, the OSCE representative on freedom of the media. We work on a daily basis with the 57 participating states of the OSCE on protecting freedom of expression and freedom of the media, and on the rules that they decide and the legislation which regard internet. And I think this discussion is very necessary, and we have seen with the debate on coherence and jurisdiction and all the works that has prepared this meeting today, that it is absolutely needed to reconcile, I think Jean-Paul used this expression, the different attempts. And if it is not done in the coming times, and that's why these 3 days meetings could be very, very helpful, there will be a clash at a time between the different concerns. It's very clear that the state, and we see it, are strong demands regarding the fight against terrorist content or propaganda, the fight against hate speech, the fight against racism and anti-Semitism online. And they take measure. And if we don't promote that kind of framework that Cathy Brown suggested, which could be, even if not exactly the same rules everywhere, but the same guidelines, the same principle, we will have a very much fragmented rules of regulation of internet, and the kind of equilibrium that we will find in most advanced democracy, where ultimately we can think that even if there is a strong restriction which are imposed to internet intermediaries and actors, the judiciary, the Supreme Court, all that things will protect freedom of expression and the freedom of users. In other contexts, and we have very different membership in the OSCE, it will not be balanced at all. So I think it's very important, that discussion, and I would just suggest that every actor, including those who has been historically the more reluctant to any kind of regulation of internet, and we are very supportive of this because it means also a lot of permissivity, it means a very strong protection of freedom of users and freedom of expression. But I think that all actors today has to bring their contribution so that this framework could be really respective, as Franny just mentioned before, of human rights principles as they are enshrined in the UN Charter and in the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights. Otherwise, it will not be a jungle. It will be the end of the open internet and the end of the possibility to access to information and to use internet for freedom of expression everywhere worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Next in line is Thomas.
Yes, hello, good evening, everybody. Thomas Schneider from the Swiss government. There were a number of things that have been said today that I think are very important and fundamental, and we should keep them in mind for tomorrow's work. One point is the one that Malcolm made about how to earn trust and that doesn't only go for governments, it also goes for companies. If you have a set of clear and transparent values that is transformed into a framework that allows to implement the values in cases that are comparable, that guarantee some level of equal treatment and so on and so forth, that is a fundamental thing that we should, let's say, continue to develop in the 21st century, in the digital world, and not just because we need to find so-called quick solutions, throw everything away. Some things are different in the digital world, but not everything is different, and also in the way we should implement our values into concrete frameworks, I think, is not fundamentally different. Also, what Joe CANNATACI has said about inconsistencies within governments is a huge challenge. You see this also, just to take the example of the past days and weeks, if you follow ICANN, is how to interpret something called the GDPR. If you listen to different parts of governments, whether it's the EU Commission or other governments, it is extremely challenging to have a clear assumption what this could mean. And I think governments need to learn to work together within their own silos and come up with a truly coordinated understanding, because otherwise it's difficult for everybody else to understand what a particular framework is about or is not about, or how to plan and deal with something. With regard to the fast solutions that we have talked about, sometimes it's better to not try to go fast. On the other hand, you cannot wait, and this has also been said, until everything is clear, because we'll never get to that point. And if I was Wolfgang Kleinwächter, then I would quote Bill Clinton, who once in San Francisco at an ICANN meeting said, internet governance is stumbling forward. So you need to start somewhere, think this through, test it, and improve, and continue discussion. So I think this is a good attempt in this conference or in this process to start somewhere. I agree with a lot that has said that developing such kind of standardized or standardizing or enabling frameworks is an extremely challenging task because many things are very complex that we are discussing. But we don't have to reinvent the wheel from scratch either. There are a lot of things that are around. We've heard the notion about self-regulation. We don't need to reinvent everything. We may also look at what is there in terms of self-regulation on traditional media, in other fields. What of these regulatory mechanisms do work? Which ones don't? Why do the ones that work and the others don't? So we can draw from existing things and try and transform it into what we are trying to do, and take things together with what works, what does not work. And we also will probably come up with the conclusion that no one-size-fits-all will work. We need to look at the different actors, the different functions within governments, with private sector, and try and develop a strategy that may be a little bit more sophisticated in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. With that, we have 2 remaining interventions. Could we please have a microphone for the gentleman over there?
Thank you. My name is Graham Smith. I'm a lawyer in private practice in London, UK. My interest here is that I've been looking at, I've been practicing internet law for since 1993, and I've been looking at cross-border issues on the internet since 1996, I think. So just to add to the list of examples of extraterritoriality, I can give you our UK Investigatory Powers Act, which in the field of surveillance, interception, data retention, cross-border data acquisition contains a long list of unilateral extraterritorial powers of various sorts. Just a more general point, listening to the debate, I was beginning to ask what kinds of frameworks, what kinds of solutions we are thinking about here. And it's always tempting in a debate of this sort to lapse into looking for harmonization, for looking at the substance of national rules, national laws, and looking for uniform national rules across the international sphere. But a jurisdiction project, it seems to me, is something rather different. Traditionally, jurisdiction has been about not achieving uniformity or harmonization, but finding ways of enabling peaceful coexistence between different legal systems, and indeed celebrating the fact that there are different legal systems out there which all have their, or mostly have their own merits. And it seems to me that a jurisdiction project we should be about building interfaces between those systems rather than seeking harmonization. And I'd just like to suggest that we should bear that in mind in our discussions.
Thank you very much. With that, the last intervention by Vint.
Thank you. It's Vint Cerf again. Here's a thought. We've been talking about frameworks, and I have been thinking about organizing principles is another phrase to use. And one example of a possible organizing principle for trying to sort through all of this is the internet architecture itself. It is a layered structure, and it can inform some of our characterizations of the problem. It's not a perfect instrument, but you might, for example, want to preserve a great deal of openness in the protocol architecture to allow new protocols to be invented, new layers of underlying support to be applied. At the same time, you might get up to the application space and content, and you might have a different view about what openness means, that maybe people can't just say anything they want to say that turns out to be harmful to other people. So maybe we should be looking for organizing principles that help us allow for some differential treatment at these different layers in the system. I have one other quick question, and that is whether Interpol's operation would give us any insight into transborder cooperation.
Thank you very much.
Well, we're transitioning into a next phase, but before we do this, you've been extremely patient, and I would suggest that you all just stand and stretch your legs for 1 second. This is a Steve Crocker suggestion because we need your attention for the rest. Yeah, we can go around and say, okay. So it's just a way to stretch, you can move. All right, that's it. Thank you. So I cannot, we're entering the next segment that will basically explain how we're going to work tomorrow. But after the discussion that we had, I cannot help but try to pick a few things that you've been saying, even if it's a one-liner that will help us do the summary afterwards. But it's also a way to sort of weave threads in a discussion that I've covered a lot of topics. So there's no particular order. One is what Uri Rosenthal was saying about connecting the different processes. One of the core elements to have policy coherence is that everybody knows what the others are doing. This is a portion of what we will do in the beginning of the morning tomorrow. The second thing is what Steve Del Bianco was using as counter-urgency discourse. And if I understood correctly, this is about the general notion of what are the consequences even for yourself if you adopt this thing. So I want to connect this to what we were discussing about scalability and what happens if everybody does what you're doing. To give you an example, I often tell my American interlocutors, think about the regimes that you are establishing right now, because one day people with Chinese origin in San Francisco will actually be using Weibo or Sina or whatever more, and you will be in the position of being the requester and not the receiver of the request. So think about it. It's the slicing the pizza type of thing, if you know the analogy. About the Convention on Cybercrime and the question of urgency and the pressure of urgency, maybe Jan will correct me, but if I'm not mistaken, a triggering factor and an accelerating factor in the adoption of the Convention on Cybercrime that had been in discussion for a while before was 9/11, and it was a catastrophic event that basically triggered, and maybe I'm wrong, that's what I've heard, but if I'm wrong, I stand to be corrected. The reason I was mentioning this is not for the historic accuracy, if I'm wrong. It's mainly because there's a fear that not only urgency, but potentially catastrophic situations might be the things that will only be triggering the actual solutions. And I don't want, we shouldn't want to be basically waiting for something really dramatic to happen to trigger a reaction that, again, will be a knee-jerk reaction. So the more we can think about it in advance, the better. I think policy coherence within governments is something that has been amply documented. I can tell for experience that among companies, it's the same. If you talk about the policy department in companies, the legal department in companies, the marketing department in companies, the operational people who are dealing with those issues, they have exactly the same kind of divergence, and it's sometimes difficult to reconcile. One of the objectives of the process that we're running is to allow the interaction even across the silos inside each entity, and it's actually proving very, very efficient, because the data protection authorities from various countries have much more in common than they have sometimes with the Ministry of Interior or Ministry of Justice of their own country. Daniel was mentioning something that triggered a notion, which is the notion of perfection. There's urgency on the one hand and patching quickly, and the other dimension is we need to find the perfect solution for those things. And I think the spirit of the internet, as has been mentioned several times, is stumbling forward, is inventing, is making things as the need arise and finding solutions problem by problem, issue by issue, and make the best effort and move forward. I don't come back on extraterritoriality. This is a question that we need to map as much as possible. The term framework is getting a lot of traction, and I'm very happy about it, because we've been using the expression of cooperation frameworks for a long time. Picking on what Vint was saying, there is, in this notion of layers, a distinction that I would like to insert here quickly, which is the distinction between frameworks for policy making versus frameworks as solutions, i.e. regimes. You know that the definition of internet governance is the development by the different stakeholders in their respective roles of principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures, and programs that shape the development and use of the internet. Most of you are probably familiar with the fact that principles, norms, rules, decision-making principles, and programs is the definition of an international regime. So fundamentally, what we're talking about when we talk about internet governance, and particularly this subset that is in governance on the internet, is how do we develop in a multi-stakeholder manner regimes that actually help shape the behavior and the things regarding the use of the internet. And this notion of layers, I think what we're doing here together is working at the two different layers at the same time, which is making it difficult, but at the same time is a bootstrapping strategy, is by discussing the solutions, we're actually creating at the same time the framework for policy making that we all need, without spending 20 years discussing where the framework discussion should take place. So I think the term framework is something that is in mind. Very quickly, the notion of the abuses are moving targets is a very important thing by Rob. The notion of how much of the cloud is a space, how much do we think about a regime for the cloud, and when you look at the data stream, the question of accessing data irrespective of the location is pointing in the direction of thinking of a cloud regime of sort. Malcolm was highlighting basically the fundamental question of what is due process across borders for those issues that are not the traditional ones, and how much can we transpose this in a new environment. I think maybe not everybody has picked on something that Catherine Maher has mentioned, which is extremely important and will certainly be rediscussed tomorrow, which is that a lot of the governance of the platform that is Wikipedia is done on a language basis. And this is a very important element that I hope she will have the opportunity to develop more. I love the notion, the comment by the person from Singapore about statistics, and I think this is going to be an important ongoing discussion, not necessarily for the Secretariat itself, but also among the members of the group. And I love the expression, non-binding doesn't mean no accountability. That's a very interesting element, because transparency can bring accountability even if things are not binding. Mapping the different dimensions of policy coherence, all the comments about the diversity of situations and the one-size-fit-all or one-size-fit-one, and how the unintended effects can be when you apply one regime to very different people in the long chain of operators. And I think I'm almost getting in the end. The difference, one of the last comments, between harmonization and the direction we're clearly going into, which is interoperability between regimes rather than harmonization and uniformity, and the notion of interfaces between different regimes. This is what we're talking about, and the reason why we try to put policy coherence on the table, because maybe there's a one single regime that will emerge on most of those issues, but in most cases what is at stake is interoperability between different operations. And finally, to come to Michael Geist, there is indeed, apart from the need to broaden the geographic scope, there is a very difficult category of interlocutors that we're trying to address, but that is difficult to reach, is the courts. Because they are not participating by definition in most of those issues, and we're trying to find the right entry points. So anything that can be suggested in that regard will be wonderful. With that, and I could continue on because there were many, many useful comments, I just wanted to make this sort of list because sometimes making an impressionist painting provides a picture in the end, and you can put a certain number of one-liners and get actually a result that is useful.